Go for it.
Okay. I'd like to welcome everyone back to this second session of this compassion program that we're currently undertaking here. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering this evening. This session is about the actual compassion practice. And this is the second of 5 sessions in this compassion program. Yes, on Monday, we looked at the loving kindness practice. Together with that, how to deal with attachment. Today, we'll be looking at the compassion practice, and together with that, how to deal with anger. Next week, we'll be rounding out these 4 immeasurables by looking at empathetic joy and equanimity. The following week, on the Monday, the exchanging self with others approach to achieving bodhicitta. And then on the Wednesday, the associated with that, the Tong Len practice, the giving and taking practice. And the recommended reading for this program is the 4 immeasurables from Alamos, and in the context of the exchanging self with others, the Buddhism with an attitude, also from Alan Wallace. Before we go into this evening's session, let's just start by doing a short meditation, just relaxing the body, relaxing the mind, and setting a good motivation. So finding a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body. Simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. Mouth and jaw soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes soft and relaxed. And in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest. To come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Not doing anything at all. Simply being present. Resting in that stillness. and setting a positive motivation for this evening's session. And try to make your motivation as expansive as possible. Try to include others in your motivation as well. And then keeping this motivation in mind, we can slowly end this meditation and begin our discussions together here this evening. Let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this evening's session. We'll begin with a short review of some of the points from Monday's session. We'll then look at the actual compassion practice, what it is and how to go about it. We'll do a guided meditation on cultivating compassion. Following that, we'll look at anger, what it is and how to deal with it. Then a guided meditation on dealing with anger. Then we'll look at how to dispel some misconceptions regarding anger. And then a topic called cognitive fusion, which I think you might find very helpful regarding or relating to not only anger, but mental afflictions in general. And time for question answer at the end, and then dedicate as normal. We saw in Monday's session that we can talk about two main wings of practice, of wisdom and compassion, and that at the foundation level, exemplified by the Theravada Buddhist traditions, the wisdom wing are these three marks of existence, of realizing impermanence, suffering, no self. And the compassion wing, the four immeasurables, often called the four Brahma Viharas within Theravada tradition. And then in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, we build on both of those. In terms of the wisdom, we build on it with the wisdom of emptiness. And on the compassion wing of practice, then we build on the four immeasurables with this aspiration of bodhicitta. And so the core of our practices here in the compassion wing are these four immeasurables we see listed here of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And then in addition to that, we are building on that with this exchanging self with others, which is one of the main methods used to cultivate bodhicitta. And within that, then this tonglen, or giving and taking practice. So they are the topics we cover in these 5 sessions. And then together with that, in the last session, we looked at dealing with attachment. In this session, how to deal with anger. And then also in the last session, the 5th session, how to integrate this compassion practice or compassion training into daily life. We saw there with loving kindness, which is a translation of the Sanskrit term Maitri, or the Pali term metta, that loving kindness is defined as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. Which means if we want to cultivate loving kindness, we need to know what is happiness. We saw there that we can talk about 2 types of happiness, the temporal happiness, or in other words, pleasure, and the genuine happiness, the inner well-being. And that when we are cultivating loving kindness, we're mainly focusing on the second one of those. And to be able to cultivate that, then we need to know what are the causes for this genuine happiness. And we saw there that in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, that's normally presented as the Noble Eightfold Path. In the Mahayana traditions, normally presented as the 6 perfections. The Noble Eightfold Path will enable us to achieve the goal of nirvana, 6 perfections, the goal of enlightenment. And this is how genuine happiness is talked about in those 2 traditions. But whether we talk Noble Eightfold Path or 6 perfections, we saw there that both of those can be condensed into the same 3 core areas of practice. So the 3 higher trainings of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. They are the causes for genuine happiness. But then also we need to know, how do we cultivate those causes? ethics. We cultivate ethics by avoiding harmful behavior. We cultivate concentration through the shamatha practice, develop single point concentration. And we're cultivating wisdom through the vipassana practice. In the Theravada traditions, that's exemplified by the 3 marks of existence. In the Mahayana traditions, the practice of emptiness. So then if we know all of those things, then we can really cultivate that loving kindness for ourselves and others. If we know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes? And then when we go about cultivating loving kindness, we saw that we do that in stages. First, we start with ourselves, then expand to friends, then strangers, difficult people, so-called enemies, and then towards all living beings, which is immeasurable loving kindness, meaning loving kindness towards immeasurable living beings. In other words, all living beings. And we also then talked about attachment, and that we saw that attachment is a mental affliction. It's one of our main mental afflictions, and it's defined as it's being a mental factor, sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and then wishes to possess and hold the object. Why? Because it believes that object is a source of our happiness. And being a mental affliction, we are to eliminate it fully, to let go of attachment. But letting go of attachment doesn't mean then suddenly we become detached from everything, because attachment and detachment are the 2 extremes that we tend to oscillate between. So letting go of attachment is really all about non-attachment, and that is achieved through coming to realize the nature of reality, because both attachment and detachment really come from a distorted view of reality. So the middle way between those is non-attachment, and we really fully achieve that through coming to realize nature of reality. And then we looked at dispelling some misconceptions regarding attachment, that we need attachment to enjoy things. In fact, we saw there that attachment interferes with our enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life. And also that in a relationship, there are these 2 dynamics, attachment and loving kindness, and that attachment actually causes problems in relationships. And we are to, the more we can reduce and eliminate that, the more we can increase the loving kindness aspect, the better our relationships will be. And also that mental afflictions such as craving and attachment actually interfere with creativity. That if we reduce and eliminate mental afflictions, we'll open up a space for creativity to emerge more easily, and we'll actually become more creative. And then in terms of dealing with attachment, we saw there that the first step is simply to have a clear understanding of attachment, what it is and how it leads to suffering. Because if we don't have that clear understanding, we'll just think that attachment actually is useful, it's bringing me some happiness, we won't want to get rid of it. And then having that clear understanding that we want to be able to eliminate it, then the second step is to cultivate this view of genuine happiness. Because as long as we see that the source of happiness is out there, then anytime we encounter something pleasant, naturally attachment will follow. But if we can cultivate this view of genuine happiness, understanding the source of happiness lies within, then we can start to let go of attachment. And to actually work with attachment as it's arising, to deal with attachment, the first thing we need is mindfulness. Without mindfulness, then simply attachment will arise, it'll take control of our mind, and then it'll be a big mess. So the key is to catch it early as it's arising. For us to be able to do that, we need mindfulness. And that mindfulness is cultivated through shamatha practice. And if we can simply observe the attachment as it's arising, we're free of it, it can't go anywhere, and it will simply dissipate by itself. We don't need to fight with it. And in addition to using mindfulness, we can apply antidotes. We saw there that, particularly from the vipassana or wisdom side of the practice, we can apply the antidotes of impermanence, because if we can see the object that we're attached to is changing moment by moment, there's nothing for attachment to grab hold of. And then if we apply the antidote of emptiness, we can come to see that there's no beauty objectively in the object, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We'll be able to let go of attachment. So here we see that in actually dealing with attachment, effectively, we need to engage in these other areas of practice, that not just the compassion aspect of practice, but we need the preliminary practices to cultivate view of genuine happiness, shamatha practice for mindfulness, vipassana practice for antidotes. Therefore, we need an integrated approach to practice to be effective, specifically here in terms of dealing with attachment. So let's now have a look at compassion. And we'll begin using that same quote as we used on Monday for loving kindness, the one from Shantideva, the great 8th century Indian master. He says, "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." Compassion here is a translation of the Sanskrit and Pali terms karuna, and it's defined as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So like loving kindness, we can see that also here, compassion is not an emotion, it's an aspiration, it's a wish. Empathy is the emotion that precedes compassion. Now, we already have a desire to be free of suffering. However, it's often misdirected. And because of that, as Shantideva said, then desiring to escape from suffering, we hasten right toward our own misery. Therefore, if we really want to be able to cultivate compassion, we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how do we eliminate those causes? Because if we don't know those three things, then compassion is just words with no meaning. So let's look at those 3 points or 3 topics. Firstly, what is suffering? Normally, we understand the word suffering to mean unpleasant, painful, physical and mental experiences. And we want to be free of those. And this is very obvious. However, here, when we talk about compassion, the wish to be free of suffering and its causes, we're talking about much more than wishing to be free of unpleasant experiences. Because here, the original term is, Sanskrit term is dukkha, the term for suffering. And the etymology of this word dukkha, the prefix du means bad, ka can mean space or hole. So it literally can sort of mean like a bad space, meaning something not quite right, or bad hole. Often the analogy given there in the old text was you had a wooden cart with an axle and a wheel, and the axle didn't fit in the hole in the wheel properly, so it wasn't turning freely. So it was sort of a bit of a bumpy ride. So the word dukkha, very difficult to translate into English, because I think there is no word that has the same meaning. And most oftenly, it's translated as suffering. But here, to understand what the word dukkha really encompasses, which is much more than we understand normally with the word suffering, we can talk about 3 types of dukkha. The first type of dukkha is the dukkha of suffering. Now here the word is referring to our unpleasant experiences. So this is very obvious, we want to be free of that. Then we can talk about the dukkha of change, which is referring to our pleasant experiences. They're called change because they're transient, they're temporary, they're stimulus-based, they finish. This is not so obvious because normally we tend to identify pleasure with happiness. But as we saw on Monday's session, pleasure is not happiness, not in the nature of happiness. And so here we end up with craving and attachment for our pleasurable experiences, which just creates suffering. So we'd like to be free of that attachment. But actually there's something deeper going on that we want to be free of that's not very obvious at all. And that is called all-pervasive dukkha. And that all-pervasive dukkha means that our life is pervaded by the potential for suffering to arise in our life. That there's nowhere we can be or go or do and be completely free of that potential. So therefore, the deepest level of compassion is the wish to be free of this unsatisfactory state, the state whereby there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. Why is that potential there? Is because our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions. As long as we have craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, and so forth in our mind, there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. So why are we stuck in this state? What are the causes of suffering? The mental afflictions. And we saw there on Monday that we can condense all the mental afflictions down to the three main core mental afflictions called the three poisons of ignorance, attachment, aversion. Ignorance here in the three poisons is our distorted view of reality. And in the Vipassana practice, we focus mainly on four particular distorted views. The first is to see things which are changing as unchanging. We overcome that by realizing impermanence, that everything's changing moment by moment. The second distorted view is we tend to see pleasure as happiness. We overcome that by realizing dukkha or suffering, that our pleasurable experiences are not in the nature of happiness. The third is we tend to see where there is no self a self, grasping to an autonomous self. We overcome that through the Vipassana practice of no self, realizing there is no autonomous self here. But at the deepest level, the ignorance that mind is contaminated by is we grasp onto things which are dependent as independent, that we grasp onto an independent me and an independent objective world. And through that grasping, then we end up with attachment to pleasant things because they seem to be the source of our happiness. We end up with aversion to unpleasant things because they seem to be the source of our suffering. And then all of the other mental afflictions come from that. How do we get rid of those causes of suffering? How do we eliminate them? Here we have a verse from Nagarjuna, great 2nd century Buddhist master who's really the founder of the Madhyamika philosophical system, which describes this view of emptiness. And he says, by extinguishing actions and mental afflictions, there is liberation. So to be liberated from suffering, we need to get rid particularly of our mental afflictions. But he says these actions and mental afflictions arise from misconceptions. This misconception that things are inherently attractive or inherently unattractive from their own side. And these misconceptions arise from elaborations. Elaborations here is another word for ignorance, grasping to independent existence. So those misconceptions which sees things as either inherently attractive or inherently unattractive come from this fundamental ignorance. And he says elaborations will cease through cultivating emptiness. By coming to realize emptiness, realizing that nothing exists independently, we can overcome that ignorance, overcome mental afflictions, and overcome the suffering they produce. Therefore, if we know then what suffering is in terms of what dukkha, the cause of suffering, the mental afflictions, we eliminate those causes through particularly the Vipassana practice of emptiness, then we can really cultivate compassion for ourselves and others. As with loving kindness, we cultivate this in stages. Traditionally in the text, 4 stages mentioned again. First, compassion to friends, most easy. Then slowly expand out to strangers. Once we're comfortable there, start to expand out to include difficult people, so-called enemies, eventually to all living beings. Immeasurable compassion. But as with loving kindness, I think in our modern world, we need to add one more step at the beginning, which often we don't see in the meditation text. That is, first cultivate compassion for ourselves. Because if we don't have compassion for ourselves, we won't be able to expand out to others. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do a compassion practice, starting with ourselves and then slowly expanding out through these stages. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's do that compassion practice. We begin as always by preparing the body, setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. A vigilant posture is to keep the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed completely at ease. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm, not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And we can begin by cultivating compassion for ourselves and then expanding out to others. And we can begin, as we did in the earlier practice of loving kindness, by first imagining the inner purity of our mind, a level of our mind that is untouched by any of the mental afflictions. To imagine this inner purity of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And then imagine your mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing your mental afflictions and suffering at your heart, dissolving it into the inner purity of your mind, your inner wisdom. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now you're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And rest in that freedom, rest in that purity. And just as you wish to be free of suffering, so does everyone else. So next bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one, who's currently experiencing some sort of physical or mental problem or suffering. And picture them very clearly in front of you. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of that problem, free of that suffering. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions. And imagining them problem or suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And imagine the black cloud is completely extinguished. And now they're completely free of that problem, free of that suffering. And take delight in this. And next bring to mind someone who you know well, but is neither a friend nor someone who you dislike. And picture them very clearly in front of you. They're just like yourself in wanting to be free of suffering. So arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they are free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions and suffering. Imagining their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. And imagine now they're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And take delight in this. And next, bring to mind someone, a difficult person, someone who you dislike. Imagine them very clearly in front of you. They are also just like yourself in wanting to be free of suffering. So arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they are free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions and suffering. Imagining their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. And then imagine they're completely free of their mental afflictions and suffering. And take delight in this. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest in that inner purity of mind, which is in the nature of compassion. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Some tips for this practice. As with loving kindness, it's very much recommended to start by cultivating compassion for ourselves first, particularly if we're suffering from low self-esteem. And in this practice, we can focus on individuals or even on groups of people. And then how to cultivate for difficult people, because often seems like they don't deserve compassion. So the answer to that will lie after the next meditation, where we'll look at this topic of cognitive fusion. And again, if you find visualization difficult or it doesn't really do anything for you, you can leave it out if you wish. And because the main emphasis, the main point in this practice is simply the aspiration of wishing to take the suffering from them, rather than having very clear visualizations. That's secondary. Clear visualization can make it more powerful, but the main point is the compassion, is the aspiration, the wish for them to be free of that suffering. Now, obstacles to this compassion practice. Again, we can talk about near enemy and far enemy. The far enemy is what's diametrically opposite which is cruelty, wishing them to actually suffer. And we'll be looking at that a little bit in the context of how to deal with anger, which is coming up shortly. The near enemy, here we can talk about really two near enemies, something that seems like compassion, but actually is corrupting the compassion. One is despair, that we simply see all this suffering and we have a lot of despair. And one way to overcome that, we'll be looking at this practice of empathetic joy in the next session, next week. And then another near enemy is pity, that we see others suffer and we sort of have pity for them. And when we have pity, we tend to sort of be putting ourselves above others, that, you know, poor you, you know, you're suffering, but sort of I'm okay sort of thing. So one way to help overcome that is through this exchanging self with others, which we'll be looking at in session 4, which will come the week after next. So let's now have a look at anger and what it is and how to deal with it. Anger in Sanskrit is pratika, in Pali, very similar, patika. Anger, like attachment, is a mental affliction. It's a klesha. And when we talked about mental afflictions or kleshas, the extensive presentation in Buddhist psychology, we have a list of 26. The condensed presentation is 6 root mental afflictions. And then we condense that even more into these 3 poisons, 3 main mental afflictions. Definition of anger here is that it is a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and thus wishes to harm the object. Why? Because anger sees that object as a source of our suffering. What we see here, as with attachment and other mental afflictions, is this factor of exaggeration, of distortion, that mental afflictions tend to exaggerate and distort what we apprehend. Where does anger come from? Like attachment, it comes from our distorted view of reality. In particular, this grasping onto independent me, independent objective world. Then it's when it seems like we have someone unpleasant appearing to us or something unpleasant, then anger is a very forceful type of aversion, believing that that personal thing is the source of our suffering. Anger, like attachment, because it's mental affliction, is to be fully eliminated. But here I think one of the confusions that comes with anger, as we saw with attachment, was in attachment, the word attachment, how it's used in Buddhism and psychology is not exactly the same, as we saw that the other day. Similarly here, I think how the word is used in psychology and here in Buddhism is not the same. And this was really highlighted to me a while ago. I read a book from quite a well-known psychologist. And he said, to paraphrase him, he said something like, "You Buddhists have got it completely wrong. It's not about completely eliminating anger. It's about having the right type of anger at the right time in the right amount." He said, but otherwise, how could you deal with difficult situations such as social injustice? So it was very clear to me he didn't really appreciate or understand how the word anger is used in Buddhism. We see in the definition here, inbuilt into how the word is used here, the intention to harm. In social injustice, if we have an intention to harm people who are engaging in social injustice, then instead of becoming this part of the solution, we become part of the problem because we're also attacking and harming others. And I think here, as we saw with attachment, it really points to the point that in Buddhist psychology, we don't really talk about emotions. As I mentioned, I think there's no word in Sanskrit or Tibetan for the word emotion. Rather, we are really focusing on what is driving emotions, what's underlying the emotions, the verbal and physical displays. It's our intentions. And that's why we saw that normally love and compassion are seen as emotions, but in Buddhism, they're not emotions. They're in aspiration and wish and intention. Similarly with attachment and anger, it's not an emotion, it's really an intention. Here, the intention to harm, in attachment, the intention to hold and possess. So this is why it's often, I think, a little bit difficult to discuss these, between Buddhism and psychology, because we're not really talking about exactly the same thing. And that's why I think a lot of confusion arises. Sorry, yeah, finish that. So how do we deal with anger? Very similar approach to attachment and actually mental afflictions in general. First, to have a clear understanding of anger, that it's a mental affliction, that it leads to suffering. We need to eliminate it 100%. Then we'll have the aspiration to be able to work with it, to eliminate it. Again, we need to cultivate the view of genuine happiness through the preliminary practices. Because again, if we see the source of suffering is coming from out there, then soon as something unpleasant comes, we'll have aversion, maybe hostility, anger, hatred will naturally follow. Then how to deal with anger as it's arising. Again, first step, we need mindfulness that we cultivate through shamatha practice. To catch anger early, we have this little window of opportunity from when anger first arises until it takes control of our mind. Without mindfulness, it's very difficult to catch that window. That usually by the time we know we're angry, our mind is out of control. And about the only thing we can really do then is get out of that situation fast before we say and do things that we're going to regret. So the solution is to catch it before it takes control of our mind. For that, we need mindfulness. If we can simply observe it as it's first arising, we're free of it. It can't do anything to harm us. It will simply dissipate. We don't need to fight with it. Similarly, we can apply, in addition to that, we can apply antidotes. One antidote that's often mentioned in the text is patience. And we'll look at a misconception regarding patience after the next meditation. But also we can use the Vipassana wing, the emptiness is like attachment. We can investigate the object of our anger, the person or object, to come to see that the unattractiveness, unpleasantness is not inherently there in the object or person. It's something that's created by the mind. That just like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, then the ugliness is in the eye of the beholder. And then the anger can dissipate. And so as with attachment, then practicing some of these methods of dealing with anger in meditation, becoming familiar with them, and then really applying them in daily life. That's what we're going to do now. We're going to do meditation, going through some of these approaches to get familiar with them so that later we can apply them in daily life. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's do that practice now. Setting up a good posture, back straight, and body relaxed. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. and simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Anger is a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and then wishes to harm the object. Why? Because it believes that object is the source of our suffering. Let's now have a look at some ways of dealing with anger. First, bring to mind a situation where you got angry or frustrated when something didn't work out the way you wanted it to. And picture the scene very clearly. And then ask yourself, could I have done something about that situation? If we can do something to change a situation, then there's no need to get angry. We simply make the change. And if there's nothing we can do to change a situation, then what's the use in getting angry? It doesn't help. It doesn't solve anything. Now think of a situation where you got angry when someone else criticized you. Again, picture the scene very clearly. And then ask yourself, was their criticism valid? If what they said was true, why get angry? Because they're giving us the chance to correct our faults and to improve ourselves. And if what they said was untrue, then since they're completely mistaken, we can simply ignore what they're saying. And regardless of whether their criticism was valid or not, they're providing us an opportunity to develop the quality of patience. So in fact, they're being very kind to us. Now think of a situation where you got angry in a conflict with another person. Again, picture the scene very clearly. Now, instead of looking at the situation from your own perspective, assume the perspective of the other person. Try to imagine how the situation would look to them. View the situation through their eyes. When we try to understand their viewpoint, we can see that they're just like us. They're just trying to be happy, and that due to their confusion and mental afflictions, they're just creating suffering for themselves and those people around them. And in this way, by distinguishing the person from their behavior, we can begin to develop compassion for them. And if their behavior is inappropriate, we can address that bad behavior without attacking the person. Now, think of a situation where you often get irritated or frustrated. And allow some irritation or frustration to arise. Now, instead of focusing on the situation, look directly at the irritation or frustration itself. Don't try to push it away. What is the nature of this irritation or frustration? Is it something solid and concrete? Or does it change over time? If we look directly at the irritation or frustration in this way, does it have any power over us? Do we need to fight with it? Or does it simply start to dissolve? Now think of a person who makes you angry or irritated. And picture them very clearly in front of you. Now mentally dissect this person and try to pinpoint precisely what it is exactly that makes you so angry or irritated. Perhaps it's something they said. If so, words are just sounds. So which particular sound is irritating, makes you angry? Or perhaps it's something that they did, some action. If so, actions are just movements of the body. So which particular movement of the body is irritating? Or perhaps it's simply their appearance that makes you angry or irritated. If so, appearances are simply colors and shapes. So which particular color or shape is irritating or makes you angry? And so see how it is our mind that creates the irritating person by interpreting the situation in a certain way and then applying labels such as annoying or irritating. And we then go on to mistake our concept of the person for the person themselves. We see them as inherently irritating. And so, in conclusion, recognize that by engaging in these sorts of reflections repeatedly, relating them to situations in our life, we can clear up a lot of anger and frustration. And we can develop a much more healthy way of looking at things and make a strong determination to do so. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So let's have a look at some common misconceptions regarding anger. So most of us appreciate that anger is very harmful and we need to eliminate it. But sometimes there is this thought, well, but actually I need anger sometimes. In fact, I need anger to deal with difficult situations. Without anger, I wouldn't be able to deal with them. No one is debating the fact that anger is very forceful. But what we saw in the definition, and we know from our own experience, is that anger exaggerates and distorts. And that what happens is then we tend to overreact or respond in a very inappropriate way. And rather than resolving the difficult situation, it often gets much worse. And we sort of know that from our own experience. And so therefore, the Buddhist answer is the solution is don't get angry. Instead of practice patience instead of anger when you're faced with these difficult situations. But then the doubt arises often, but if I practice patience, people will just walk over the top of me. Because often people feel or believe that patience is just, oh, that means I just have to sit there and do nothing. This is not patience. Patience is not a behavior. Patience is a mental attitude. And patience here is defined as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So when Buddhism recommends that we practice patience, what Buddhism is really saying is when you're faced with a difficult situation, remain calm. Because if we remain calm, we can more clearly and accurately evaluate the situation and have a better chance of responding in a better way. But sometimes we need to be forceful. And so sometimes then the doubt is, well, um, if I need to be forceful, how can I be forceful if I can't resort to anger? And the Buddhist answer is compassion. And then from that, often people say, but hang on, but compassion's a sign of weakness. And anger is a sign of strength. Well, actually, it's the exact opposite. Anger is a sign of weakness because it means that we have to resort to dominating people in difficult situations to try and resolve it. So that's a sign of weakness. Compassion is a sign of strength, because compassion is not about sitting there smiling and saying nice things to people. Compassion is helping them to overcome their suffering and cause of suffering. So if they're behaving badly, the compassionate thing to do is to help them to overcome that negative behavior. And if they're, for example, physically attacking us, the compassionate thing to do would be not sit there and allow them to do that, but if necessary, use physical force to try and restrain that person, to help that person. Because if we sit there and allow them to behave badly, then that's the opposite of compassion. But if we allow anger to come into that, we will probably use excessive force, and then rather than resolving the situation, we'll just make it worse. So that's some common misconceptions. Now I'd like to look at this topic of cognitive fusion for a number of reasons. First is, why is it that we get angry with others who behave badly? And why is it then that it's so difficult to have forgiveness or compassion for them? And I think there's a simple answer, and it's to do with this cognitive fusion. Now, the correct perspective, if someone's behaving badly, is to simply see and acknowledge there is a person doing a bad or harmful action. That's the correct perspective. But often in that situation, we have a different perspective. Now, often our perspective is, oh, there's a bad person, there's a horrible person, nasty person, evil person. So what we're doing there is we are fusing the person to their behavior and making them one thing. This is called cognitive fusion in psychology. And this is a false, invalid perspective. Because there are two things here. There's a person and their behavior. They're not one thing. But if we do this cognitive fusion, and we tend to do it very often, we're in trouble. Because in any given situation, we've got two choices: accept or reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. But reject on the basis of cognitive fusion ends up as us attacking the person, rejecting the person, getting angry at the person. Because actually, it's the thing we don't like is the behavior. But because we've glued the behavior to the person, we've made them one thing, then we direct our rejection to the person. We get angry, we attack the person. And if we understand that that is not helpful, the only other option left is accept. But if we do cognitive fusion, accept translates into accepting their bad behavior, which also is not okay. But they're our two choices, really, if we do cognitive fusion: accept their bad behavior, or reject and attack or get angry at the person. And then it becomes difficult to have forgiveness and compassion, because having forgiveness or compassion for a bad person feels like what we're saying is, oh, what you did is okay, I don't mind. Of course we should mind. But that's why it becomes very difficult, because it seems like we're somehow condoning their bad behavior. And it's worse than that, because if we do cognitive fusion, then we end up with a fixed, biased view of that person. They're just a bad person, which means it becomes very difficult to acknowledge any good things that they do, because bad people don't do good things. And if they happen to do something good, we'll sort of brush it off and say, well, they didn't really mean it because they're just such a bad person. And also then that cognitive fusion leads to conflict, because then we put people into these two groups of good people and bad people. I'm one of these good people. That's those bad people over there. So let's get rid of those bad people. We hate those bad people, and let's get rid of those bad people. And then, of course, we end up judging and criticizing the person. Whereas actually, instead of judging the person, we should be evaluating behavior. So the simple solution to all of this is don't do cognitive fusion, because it's a false, invalid perspective. Rather, simply adopt the correct perspective and acknowledge there is a person doing a bad action. then we can accept the person, i.e. have forgiveness or compassion for the person, and at the same time reject their negative behavior, not tolerate that negative behavior, and help that person to address that negative behavior. And that way, instead of the conflict of us versus them, good versus bad, we'll understand, well, they're just like us, sometimes do good things, sometimes do bad things. So let's help people who do engage in bad behavior. So it leads to cooperation. And then again, instead of judging the person, we will evaluate their behavior. But not only do we do this cognitive fusion with others, we do it with ourselves. And this is, I think, why there's such an epidemic of low self-esteem and self-hatred in our modern world. Because in our modern world, we tend to have this obsessive focus on the negative together with cognitive fusion. For example, if we have done a bad action, the correct perspective is simply acknowledge, I did this bad action. But rather, instead of doing that, we often have the perspective, I'm a bad person. We do cognitive fusion. And then when we do that, when we wrongly identify ourselves with our behavior, I'm a bad person, then we judge ourselves, we criticize ourselves, we condemn ourselves, we have hatred for ourselves, we have low self-esteem because we end up with a fixed, biased view of ourselves that we're just such a bad person. And then in terms of behavior, we have a lot of guilt come because of that, because guilt comes from focusing on bad me. So guilt comes from a false, invalid perspective. We never need to feel guilty about anything because all it does is it makes us feel bad and it paralyzes us, and it's not even addressing the negative behavior. So it's completely useless and based on a false perspective. Therefore, the solution to all of this, the solution to is don't do the cognitive fusion and simply acknowledge I have done a bad action. We then, instead of criticizing and judging ourselves, we evaluate our behavior. We can accept ourselves, we can have forgiveness or compassion for ourselves. At the same time, address our negative behavior, regret our negative behavior. And then we can have good self-esteem instead of low self-esteem. So the answer to low self-esteem and self-hatred is not simply to reinforce I'm a good person. We have this obsessive focus on the negative, and we really need to focus on the positives more to have a balanced view of ourselves and others. But if we do that, if we focus on the positives with cognitive fusion, then we're in trouble, because then if we just simply reaffirm, I'm a good person, I'm a good person, I'm a good person, and that leads to this cognitive fusion, then it can become an ego trip, because we can think, well, actually, I'm really special. In fact, I'm better than everyone else. You know, I'm one of these good people. They're those bad people. I'm better than everyone. And then, of course, it becomes very difficult to acknowledge our bad behavior because I'm a good person. So actually everything I do is okay because I'm such a good person. And again, we end up with the thus, us versus them. And then if we do this cognitive fusion on the positive side, then at some point we'll probably realize, well, actually, we're not such a good person because I'm doing all these bad things. And so then it will probably just really confirm that I'm really just a bad person. So therefore, I think the solution to low self-esteem and self-hatred is not to simply flip to the other side and just do cognitive fusion on the positives. Rather, the answer is avoid cognitive fusion. Stop doing cognitive fusion. Stop identifying ourselves with our behavior, whether that is negative or positive. So if we avoid wrongly identifying ourselves with our bad behavior, then we can have good self-esteem, we can feel good about ourselves, and at the same time not tolerate our negative behavior and address our negative behavior. So that, I think, is really the answer. Because if we try to do good self-esteem simply by doing cognitive fusion on the positives, I think we can end up in these potential problems. And so all of this cognitive fusion is all about wrongly identifying ourselves and others. And here we've been mainly talking about behavior, but we can identify with thoughts, emotions, memories, habits, behavior, all sorts of things. So either we are our thoughts or we have thoughts. Either we are our emotions or we have emotions. Either we are our memories or we have memories. Either we are our habits or we have habits. Either we are our behavior or we have certain behavior. Either we are our personality or we have a certain personality. And at a deeper level, either we are our body and mind or we have a body and mind. These are all things which we have. And if we wrongly identify ourselves as any one of these things, then we will simply have mental afflictions and suffering. And so cognitive fusion at the deepest level is really this grasping onto an independent me, grasping on this is me, body and mind here, this is me. So whether it be in terms of our body and mind, or whether we identify with our behavior, I'm a bad person, or I'm an angry person, or I'm a hopeless person, or there is no such thing as technically there is no such thing as a bad person. There are only people who sometimes do bad behavior. And if we keep that in mind, we'll avoid the cognitive fusion, and then we'll find it much easier to have forgiveness and compassion for others who behave badly, much easier for us to have forgiveness and compassion for ourselves if we behave badly. But at the same time, not tolerating any negative behavior, whether it's others' behavior or our own behavior, regretting our own negative behavior, overcoming that negative behavior. I think this is really the key. So that brings us to question answer. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A now. So do we have any questions there, Miffy?
Yeah, Glenn. So Gabriella asked a question, and it was just before you started talking about cognitive fusion, but I think it's still relevant because
Sure.
she was asking, what about being angry with oneself? Is the source of that our ego?
Yeah. um, I mean, in general, we can say that all of our mental afflictions are coming from this self-grasping, grasping to an independent me. And I mean, of course, it depends how we use that term ego. But when I use the word ego, that's what I mean, a false sense of me. So if you mean by ego this sort of grasping to an independent me, then yes, ultimately all of our mental afflictions come from that self-grasping, that ego, yes.
And then if we
Which is a
are
form of cognitive fusion.
with the like not identifying with anything, if we start unpacking that and going, we're not this, we just have the behavior or the personality, there is still this incredible urge to identify with, well, but I'm this. So what do we identify with?
Nothing. It's actually, it's identification, which is another word for ignorance, that is the root cause of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. So if we understand that identification is the root cause, then we can start to overcome that. But here we need to be careful. We said we don't want to wrongly identify, in the case we were using before, wrongly identify ourselves with our behavior, you know. So to think I'm a bad person is cognitive fusion. Rather, I did a bad behavior. But we're not talking about separating person and behavior. That's the other extreme. That's the extreme. I didn't do anything, wasn't me. So we need to be careful that we're not separating. You can't separate a person and behavior. They're always linked, they're dependent, but they're not the same thing. So they're not two different things and they're not the same thing. That is the correct view. If we understand that, then we won't wrongly identify, we won't get angry at ourselves, we'll have compassion for ourselves, and at the same time, we will take responsibility for our bad behavior. It's not like, not me, it's not me, I'm not my behavior, so it's not me. So we'll take our responsibility for our bad behavior, we'll regret that bad behavior, and we'll look at ways of overcoming it.
So that really helps with how we feel about ourselves and our self-esteem or self-respect. What about issues of like racism or sexism, where you need to grab some form of identity? What's the healthy way of doing that?
Again, if we identify ourselves, it ends up as us versus them, doesn't it? We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, they're the terrorists, they're the rapists, they're the whatever. And so it's us versus them. Let's get rid of them. That's never going to be a solution. Rather, if we don't do cognitive fusion, we can correctly acknowledge that person there has a very strong habit of engaging in very harmful behavior. That person there is engaging in terrorist behavior or in bad behavior, but they're just like us. They want to be happy, they want to be free of suffering, and therefore have compassion. But compassion doesn't mean, oh, you can do what you want, I don't care. That's not compassion, that's stupidity. Compassion always has to come with wisdom. Compassion is saying that let's help that person to stop that negative behavior, because that's the result we want. And compassion can be very forceful. If someone is really engaging in very harmful behavior, we can be very forceful when necessary to stop that negative behavior. So it's not like we let all these people who are engaging in illegal activities just keep doing that. No, the compassionate thing to do is to take them out of society and try to rehabilitate them. Now what we tend to do is we judge people. You're guilty. We lock them up in a prison system where often we punish people instead of trying to rehabilitate. And statistics show in societies that punish people, they reoffend, which means even just economically, that's not a good thing to do because it's a higher cost to society. Forget about compassion. So even from an economic point of view, then what we want to be doing is trying to rehabilitate people rather than punish people. So if we do cognitive fusion, punish people, that's never going to have a solution, a good solution and a good result. Try to rehabilitate. If we can't, keep them out of society. Always using compassion. That's the only chance we've got of solving issues in the world. If we do the other, we do the cognitive fusion, we're just going to destroy ourselves, as we see in a lot of the conflicts in the world today, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's certainly not a rational response in any way, is it? Either economically
see,
or...
the problem is we're stuck in cognitive fusion. So we seem to have two choices: accept and reject. Reject means attack and kill. Accept means, oh, they can do whatever they want. None of those two solutions are useful. But that's all we've got available if we wrongly do this cognitive fusion. If we do this identification, that's where we're stuck. That's why, you know, do we attack people and get rid of people, or do we just sort of accept and let them do whatever they want? Neither of those two. We need to find the middle way. And the middle way is coming through correct view, not identifying. So the correct view is not there's a bad person, there's a person doing bad behavior. Let's address that and help them to overcome that.
And so then can you please go over the bit in the explanation, this is from Robin, when you were saying how cognitive fusion leads to also kind of on the other end of the spectrum, accepting bad behavior when we reject, you know, the bad person. So what's that end of things where we, you know, we get just accept everything? What happens there with the cognitive fusion?
Well, again, because basically in any situation, we've got two choices: accept, reject. But if we do cognitive fusion, then reject, I mean, what we're rejecting or what we don't like is behavior. But because we've glued the behavior to the person, when we do rejecting, we're directing it at the person because the behavior has suddenly become the person. So we direct the rejection at the person, which translates into attacking the person, getting angry at the person, hating the person, and so forth. That's reject. But then if we understand that attacking people is not helpful, then the only other option left is accept. But if we do accept on the basis of cognitive fusion, because what we want to do is accept the person. But if we've fused the behavior to the person, accept translates into also accepting their bad behavior, which is also not okay. So that's why we're stuck in those two choices: reject the person, attack the person, or accept behavior. That's it. So the answer is don't do cognitive fusion. Then we can accept the person and at the same time reject the behavior, because they're not the same thing.
Okay, so that makes brilliant sense. There's also a more intellectual question from Robin. Ultimately, there is no good or bad person or good or bad behavior, but conventionally there is. So why are we advised to identify bad behavior but not a bad person? So where are we going wrong in that argument?
Because a person is not the behavior. We can behavior, we can correctly label as virtuous or non-virtuous, or if we want to use the word good and bad. There's no cognitive fusion there. But when we talk about person, good or bad person, it's because their behavior or their habit or something that is good or bad. So actually, therefore, if we are putting that on the person, then we're doing the cognitive fusion. So there's no cognitive fusion to say this is virtuous or non-virtuous behavior or good and bad behavior. But if we say bad person on the basis of person doing bad behavior, then we have fused person to behavior. We've made them one thing. Yeah. So that's the difference. And we need to be very careful when we start saying things like ultimately there's no good or bad behavior. I mean, when we say that, it's a very slippery slope. What we're meaning there ultimately is that you can't find objectively good or bad behavior, but there is good and bad behavior that is merely labeled, that has causal efficacy, that functions.
Okay, so yep, that makes very good sense. Then also Ian Griffin says in some workplaces, including his, they fill out paperwork where they ask, what do they identify as? So in a way, in a workplace that can be reaffirming or to help give support, but is that also like a slippery slope?
Well, I mean, it's one thing to understand yourself in terms of your predominant habits and mental afflictions, but here we're talking about cognitive fusion. So again, it depends how we use the word identify. To identify, if we're using it simply in the context of acknowledging, I have a habit of being angry a lot, or I have a habit of being kind and so forth. That's not identification. That's just acknowledging your strengths and weaknesses and so forth. So that's completely okay. But if on top of that, we start to say and think things like, oh, because I have a strong habit of being angry, I'm just an angry person. Because as soon as we do that, it's like, that's me, I'm an angry person. You better accept that. I'm just an angry person.
That would still happen also, say, with gender issues or sexism as well, that is set up for us and them.
Of course. I mean, even when because as soon as you do the cognitive fusion, you cause division. It's us versus them. And as soon as you go into us versus them, good guys, bad guys, kind people, hateful people, as soon as you do that, then it's us versus them. Then there's conflict. So if we don't do that, we still acknowledge that person has a strong habit of getting angry, rather than there's an angry person or bad person. I'm the good person. They're the bad person. I hate that bad person. Let's get rid of that bad person. This is going to not going to give any good solution. Rather, acknowledge there's a person who is engaging, who's a very strong habit of engaging in harmful behavior. So let's try and help that person as best we can. And at the same time, of course, not tolerate their negative behavior. Be very firm with that and say, I will not tolerate that negative behavior. So when you're speaking to that person, rather than saying, oh, you're such a bad person, I mean, they're just going to react to that. Whereas if you say, you realize that action, that behavior is very harmful, then they're more likely to listen. No guarantee, but if you simply say you're a bad person, then I think there's a high probability they're going to react. Whereas if you say, do you realize that behavior is very harmful? Then there's maybe a chance of resolving the situation. So anyway, there's a lot to be said about this, but I think we're running over time.
There is. I've got one more question and just a couple of comments. So one, then just for what you were saying, comes right back to the the part of the talk on patience. So if we're dealing with people, we're getting very exasperated and frustrated with people's ignorance, then what's better to try and apply, like patience or this kind of the view, which?
I think in our Dharma or spiritual practice tool bag, we need to have lots of tools. So I think there's not one that works best in all situations. Therefore, I think it would be very helpful to, that's why we did this, for example, this meditation on dealing with anger and attachment, so that you can have a number of different things that you can try, and one may work better in a certain situation and another in another situation. So if we have half a dozen different things we can do in terms of just watching, being patient, looking at impermanence, loving kindness, emptiness, then we can apply as and when they're necessary or which works best. So I think there's not like a standard thing that we do in all circumstances. We have to see what works in each situation. But if we have all those different tools available to us, then one of them will probably be effective, at least.
Then Graham Stratton just commented that this really is like an expanded discussion on equanimity, where our happiness is inseparable from the welfare of other sentient beings, of other living beings.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that exactly, we saw, and we'll see more of that in session 4 when we talk about exchanging self with others. This sort of us versus them thing, or me versus everyone else, actually, then of course we just have attachment to friends and apathy to strangers. And so if we really want to, at the deepest level, cultivate equanimity, then we really need to overcome this cognitive fusion.
Yeah. And the very last question, which is from me, Glenn, which is in the compassion meditation, where we took on the suffering and then experienced delight. We're really delighted that they were free of it. So, I mean, that's a really new thing for me, having delight in a compassion meditation. So what's the ratio that we should have from taking on the compassion to experiencing the delight?
I mean, the delight there is really it's touching on the empathetic joy. And so I think that, as we're going to see in the next session, we have, and I've mentioned a number of times already, we have this obsessive focus in the modern world on the negative. And so even when we're doing the compassion, of course, we're focusing on the suffering and we're taking it. But then I think that it's very helpful to, balance that when we see that suffering has been alleviated, then to see that, to really be happy about that, to rejoice in that. And so I think this is really bringing in some more empathetic joy there. And also this is a real check that we're doing the compassion well, because otherwise, if we find it difficult to have joy when we see that free of suffering, then maybe our compassion practice was a little bit fake, and we're just sort of taking on some smoke, and we're not really worried about taking off anyone's suffering. So I think that that's another point. But I just like to add that in there, because it's really helping us to focus on the positives, on the joy, which I think is so important in the modern world, which is
I've never heard it before, and it seems to be really the missing key, because otherwise it's just a real downer.
Well, because also, as we're going to see in session 5, the Tonglen practice, which is a combination of loving kindness and compassion, if you add that in, then and then you have a bit of equanimity. But basically, you've got all the 4 immeasurables there in one practice, in the Tonglen practice. Yeah. And as we're going to see in the next session, there's a big advantage to covering all of the 4 immeasurables, as opposed to simply doing maybe loving kindness or maybe compassion. That if we practice all 4 immeasurables, then as a whole, it's much more powerful. And that Tonglen practice will give us that one practice, which we're going to do in session 5.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. So I better let you do the conclusions.
We've run over time here. So yes. let's finish off. What is happening here? Let's finish off by dedicating, using Shanti Deva dedication prayer. So dedicating all of our efforts in this session. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Next session will be, we haven't got a session next Monday, but it'll be just one session next week on the Wednesday. And session 3, we'll be looking at the last 2 of the 4 immeasurables, empathetic joy and equanimity. So until then, stay safe, stay well. We'll see you back next Wednesday. So bye for now.